Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is Frederick Winsness with NetHope, and I want to wish everybody a good day, good evening, but also welcome to yet another NetHope Solutions Center webinar. Today, we're continuing our ICT4D series of webinars, and speaking of a very, very pertinent topic, digital tech to help fight COVID-19 misinformation. We are very pleased to have the Sentinel Project represented today, International Rescue Committee, and National Democratic Institute, and we will get to the speakers in a few minutes. We're very pleased to have Catholic Relief Services co-produce this series with us. Before we get started, I want to go over a little bit of housekeeping. We want to make this as interactive as possible, so please open the chat window in Zoom. You do that by clicking the little chat icon on the bottom of your screen and follow along with the comments and questions, and post your questions there for a facilitated Q&A session at the end of the hour. We are recording this today, and both the recording and all the collateral presented will be posted to the NetHope Solutions Center later on today, and you will receive a follow-up email with information about that, and we encourage you to share that with colleagues and others that may be interested in this topic as well. At the very end, in your browser, you'll see an online survey pop up, and we certainly would appreciate you answer a few questions there for us to continuously improve this webinar series. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Sonia Rizzo from the Catholic Relief Services, who will be introducing the speakers. Over to you, Sonia.
Thank you very much, Frederick, and thank you very much, NetHope, for facilitating us again. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to our speakers, as misinformation and false rumors are really thriving during the global COVID-19 crisis. And therefore, in today's ICT4D webinar, we have gathered 3 experts to share insights on their initiatives using digital tools to help combat misinformation for displaced persons, but also the general public. And they will also explore how those tools can help manage and monitor the misinformation of COVID-19. So without further ado, may I please introduce our speaker panel. We have John Green Otunga. He's the East African Program Manager of HAGIGA WAHID at the Sentinel Project. Andre Heller, the Director of Signpost at International Rescue Committee, and Victoria Wellborn, a Program Manager at the National Democratic Institute, NDI. Thank you very much for joining us. I also like to mention that all speakers are sharing their insights informally for this webinar to further our peer learning. None of the comments are public statements, so if you wish to report from this session, please get in touch with me. I'll be sharing my email address in the chat box, and I will help introduce you to the speakers or their organizations for an official statement. So thank you so much, and do also share your questions in the chat box for each of the speakers or in general to the topic. We will have time for a Q&A part after the initial presentations. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce you to John Otunga, who will be sharing some insights on the HAGIGA WAHID project in South Sudan and Uganda. John, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia, for the introduction. My name is John. I work for the Sentinel Project, which is a Canadian organization dedicated to assisting communities threatened by mass atrocities through direct cooperation with peoples in harm's way and the innovative use of technology. I'll be sharing today about our project, HAGIGA WAHID, and Una HAKIKA initiative, which we deployed in Kenya. And I hope you'll be able to get insights from our work. First slide, please. So the Sentinel Project's work has mainly focused on violence prevention and peace building initiatives. Our tools and expertise are also highly relevant to many other development and humanitarian operations that involve using communication technology to engage with beneficiaries, as we shall see in my presentation. Next. Much of our work to date has focused on misinformation management, which means engaging beneficiary communities in monitoring, verifying, and countering the spread of harmful rumors and misinformation that contribute to conflict, while also helping humanitarian partners to improve their own operations by enhancing their situational awareness. And that's what HAKIKA is all about. Next. So rumors and misinformation and disinformation, especially that which circulate over social media and by word of mouth, are complex drivers of conflict and instabilities as they lead to mistrust, tension, and fear. Next. So our first project that we deployed in 2013 in Kenya is called HAKIKA, which is a Swahili word for "Are you sure?" around the Kenyan general elections after a massacre that left over 100 people dead and many other injured in Tana River County of Kenya. So a team from the Sentinel Project visited the area, and in trying to understand how it happened and why it happened, they realized that many factors such as competition for resources, historical injustices, and even ethnic politics led to violence. But rumors also played a very significant role in fueling the violence between the Orma pastoralist community and the Pokomo farmers. Next. Next. So some of the rumors at the time that were circulating in Tana River County, for example, are an outsider has armed the Orma community with 300 AK-47 to destroy the Pokomo, or a Pokomo health worker has tried to poison Orma children instead of vaccinating them, and so many others that touched, for example, on rape allegation, theft, and planned revenge attacks. So we carried out a baseline survey as a starting point for our project, and in our findings, 71% of the Tana River residents believe that rumors contributed to the violence, and increasingly people knew more about events happening at the national level than their neighboring village, for example, proving that existence of information gap, which created a very conducive environment for rumors to thrive. Next. So we established HAKIKA essentially to act as an information service to provide subscribers with neutral, accurate information in response to the rumors that arise. So this was through setting up a toll-free SMS line. We were using the code 21512, where community members will submit rumors they hear. And once HAKIKA received a report about a rumor, our team goes around into action to verify it and report back to the community members about whether the rumor is true or not. So this process involves gathering a lot of information from various resources and trying to make sense of it, while also mapping subsequent reports of rumors to see how they develop and flow through the area. And that's where WikiRumors comes in, which is our purpose-built software for managing HAKIKA workflow. Next. So as a part of our standard practice, we carried out some evaluation after years of operation. And it was interesting to see the community members appreciating the value of the project by voting it as the most trusted source of local information. Next. So what we've learned after years of practice is that for a misinformation management system to be effective, it must be fast responsive, which means being able to provide information based on what subscribers request and react to community needs, instead of broadcasting a one-way information flow. The system must ensure it's targeted, that is having the ability to send counter messaging back to specific locations or groups that have reported the rumors. And this is because it minimizes an intentional spread while also ensuring responsiveness. It must be sensitive. The initiative should be able to account for local dynamics, engage relevant stakeholders, and use appropriate communication channels, especially during verification and counter messaging. And finally, it's good for it to be timely, because with that, you prioritize and verify rumors as quickly as possible, since misinformation can travel quickly, especially with the aid of information and communication technologies. Next. So over the years, we've developed specialized software, integrated it with locally accessible means of communication, and gained extensive experience with monitoring information flows, early warning and counter messaging to contain and dispel incendiary rumors, while exploring the applicability of the model in multiple contexts. And this is where HAGIGA WAHID, which is now our project in South Sudan, is coming in. Next. So HAGIGA WAHID, which means one truth in Juba Arabic, operate the same way as HAKIKA and was deployed in South Sudan and among the refugee camps in northern Uganda, and soon we are looking into Kenya. The main goal of the project is to improve access to information on a day-to-day basis among South Sudanese refugees and ultimately support positive behavioral change by establishing training and even equipping broad community of practice focused on countering misinformation, as well as enabling effective decision-making by stakeholders, especially those focused on peace and security. Next. So South Sudan, as we all know, the history, the mass displacement due to civil wars that has led to so many refugees moving to Kenya and Uganda, and this has been due to so many factors. We looked at how we can help in this COVID-19 pandemic, which poses a significant public health challenge worldwide, a situation which is likely to be even more severe in low-income countries and fragile countries like South Sudan, and even among the displaced population. So in this context, rumors and misinformation are likely to hinder public health responses and increase the risk of interpersonal and intercommunal violence, as has been seen elsewhere in the world in regard to xenophobic attacks and all that. Next. So our contacts on the ground in the refugee settlements in both Kenya and Uganda have already sent us some indications that rumors about COVID-19 are causing significant fear. So for example, as you can see, someone sent a message to our team that a Tanzanian driver has tested positive for COVID-19 and he's held up somewhere in Arua where the refugee camp is. There are also rumors and myths about taking different drinks just to make, like, to deal with to cure or even prevent the COVID-19. Some rumors about children below the age of 10 or even the color of your skin cannot make you get the disease. Next. So in response, we deployed HAGIGA WAHID to support the response by other partners like World Health Organization. And this HAGIGA WAHID function as a responsive information service, which crowdsources rumor reports from beneficiaries who subscribe to the system, and then provides them with accurate, verified information in response. So this goes through 3 basic steps, and that is rumor monitoring, verification, and counter messaging. So in rumor monitoring, the users submit reports through SMS or voice calls with possibility of also using social media, email, or web-based interaction, and mobile application where relevant. In the verification stage, once new misinformation is identified, it is logged onto our purpose-built WikiRumors software in order to track its spread both geographically and chronologically, while the HAKIKA team verifies whether a given report is true. Then the final stage is counter messaging. So once a given rumor has been investigated and confirmed true or false, measures are implemented to contain with it appropriate message delivered through SMS, broadcast, social media, and other channels. So these include even engaging stakeholders such as community leaders, religious leaders, and other NGOs for offline intervention. So that has been my presentation. Thank you very much for your audience. If anyone has any question, feel free to send them to our email address or look at our website.
Thank you very much, John. Yeah, also, if you have any questions right now to be discussed during this webinar, please send them in the chat box. We will have time to answer those later. I also like to mention that we will make the slides available afterwards together with the recording of the webinar, so you don't need to take notes. That leaves me to introduce you to our next speaker. Andre Heller will be sharing some insights on Signpost, an initiative by the IRC as well as other partners. So Andrew, over to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning, calling in from the West Coast of the United States today, in this very strange time that we're all living in. I wanted to start off by just recognizing how wonderful and interesting the Sentinel project is. I'm already learning something from the webinar and hope to share some insights from the work that we're doing. I think that there's a lot of common links. And John, I'm already looking forward to engaging with you after the presentation to see how we can collaborate together in the future. Next slide, please. This is a quick presentation on the Signpost project. We're a collaborative entity that's been created by Mercy Corps and the IRC. And we partner broadly with other aid actors, whether international or local or in civil society, government groups, as well as UN agencies to deliver a responsive information service, much along the lines of what John had mentioned in his previous presentation. I'm going to run you through the history of the program. Talk a bit about how responsive information services help contextualize information and build trust in communities, and talk about our next steps as a program as we expand to face the challenges that the COVID-19 pandemic poses to the world. Next slide, please. So essentially, the creation of Signpost is simply an adaptation to today's context in which we do humanitarian work. Majority of this is happening within lower to middle income countries where the technology landscape is much more evolved than a lot of aid agencies have taken into consideration with their means of messaging and exchanging with their clients or beneficiaries. And one of the things that we've noted throughout our client responsiveness mechanisms is that oftentimes we'll get information requests. In fact, with many of our response mechanisms, we get up to 70% of our client responses are requests for new information. And essentially, with the work that we do, we aim to solve two problems that were also touched upon in John's presentation, and that is the need for timely and accurate information related to services and needs that people have in real time. And the other is related to agency. And that's also addressed through this responsive character of our programming. Agency is really closely linked with accountability. And that's to say that by putting people at the center of our information work, we are putting them at the driver's seat of the kind of information that they will then receive from the sector. So responsive and contextualized approaches are really the only way to counter misinformation. And you do that through building trust within effective communities. Our principle for communication is to meet people where they are digitally, in the languages that they speak, with media that they recognize, rather than unidirectional information dissemination to people. Our principle with technology is to use existing technology and to scale it for efficiency. We only build tech or tech components to patch things together when needed, or if there's a particular component that isn't available, we will build that. We also believe that there's a sector-wide efficiency gain that we get when working with proven successful platforms that are thriving in the private sector and in the public domain already. We believe in two-way communication, not just dissemination or information sharing, actual dialogue with people, responding to people's questions. And we support people to make informed choices on the issues that matter most to them. Now, with the advent of the pandemic, a lot of the existing problems in the world continue or have been severely exacerbated and compounded by the crisis, by the pandemic, and a lot of the policy responses to it. So this has frozen the asylum system in many countries. People still live with danger from other infectious diseases or protection concerns. They face displacement. And now new problems arise due to the management of the pandemic itself. And so Signpost is working as a central component of the IRC's risk communication and community engagement working group. And so we're rolling this out and scaling as a component of our pandemic response. And we're really using this to tailor towards vulnerable communities specifically. Many of the mainstream public health measures do not fully take into consideration the needs of those who are already on the margins. And we really look at this situation right now as a historical bookend where there will be the times before the COVID-19 pandemic and the times after. And we're trying to do our very best to lead with strategic decisions related to digital delivery of services so that we make smart strategic choices that will benefit our programmings for years to come. Next slide, please. So the history of the program is that it started in Greece in 2015 when thousands of asylum seekers and migrants were arriving in Greece every day. People had cell phones, they were looking to connect to Wi-Fi. A lot of the questions that they had were related to asylum procedures, which are quite complex, but they were also about seeing a doctor or different forms of basic needs that were trying to be met. So IRC and Mercy Corps collaborated to create a platform that would do service mapping. And we added a component for trained moderators from the affected communities to also engage with people and answer specific information requests. And we would produce content on a basis of, on a basis of the questions that we received. So we would create a responsive service that was anticipating some of these questions based on the kinds of inputs that people gave us. So the program was very successful. It reached 70% of the refugee population in Greece. And we scaled it throughout the European context, where we had instances set up in the Balkans as well as in Italy. We started a project in Jordan called Habrona. That was led by Mercy Corps, and we continue to work with Mercy Corps as a global partner. And in El Salvador, we opened one called Cuéntanos, which is Ask Us, and that was based around people seeking various types of services who are living in very complex situations affected by violence, deportees, returnees, and asylum seekers seeking to find safety. You'll note that with the branding of our project, it's different in every location that we deploy, and that's largely so that we can make the most contextually appropriate type of communication products for people based on feedback that we receive from communities themselves. Next slide, please. So in the aid sector, related to information and health messaging, oftentimes information will be unidirectional. It's delivered on a basis of assumptions about what people need to know. Every agency will provide information about their own services and activities. Often mass means of communication are chosen by agencies in the most broadly accepted language, but updating tends to be difficult. Policy changes tend to not be contextualized for specific individuals in vulnerable communities. And a lot of the information services are disjoined from one another. So people are kind of overloaded with information that may or may not speak to them as individuals. Next slide, please. So we endeavor to upend that system and put people first. We start our programs through assessments of what technology is currently being used, where people are digitally in areas that they work, and that also considers access to technology as well. So in some instances, we'll build programming that is based off of mass use of cell phones and smartphones. And in other instances, we focus more on practitioners and community focal points as our main client. The technology that we use is largely to create greater access to information and increased functionality of how we're able to not only deliver messaging and deliver information and articles and content, but also to analyze the kinds of questions and the interactions and engagements that we have. So we often run a website, a service map that will have all services in it that beneficiaries may want to access, a blog with articles. We've worked with tech companies to also refine our toolkit in order to use things like WhatsApp to deliver web-based content. And we work across platforms like Facebook as well in order to really meet people where they're already at. Mercy Corps and Cisco supported work has also enabled us to have the ability to deploy Wi-Fi hotspots, which can be essential for people who don't have access to the internet or in areas of low connectivity. Next slide, please. And so the way that we deliver is through moderators responding to user questions about certain services or about what a policy change or impact means to them, or asking questions about a rumor that they have heard about a way of managing their health or their family's health. We have editorial staff who gather and triangulate information and package it in ways that really is most accessible and speaks directly to the clients that we wish to help and their needs. We have service mappers, which will verify with service providers what kinds of services, when they're open, how they've been affected by public health measures. And most importantly, we work in partnerships. In the past, it's often been with legal aid providers, as many of our programs worked on asylum. But this is broad, also with service mappers that are local, also with other information sources. And we seek to connect existing sources that may be extremely good for one type of information, but not be holistic. So we don't seek to replace existing information resources. We seek to link them together and direct people in the best direction to get their specific questions replied. And central to our approach is this back and forth communication with affected communities. It really puts people at the center of it and works with recognition of their dignity and agency to allow them to navigate their journey through a crisis, through the entire arc of a crisis. And we also monitor all of our online spaces for hate speech and exploitation, and have built some simple bots and different types of tech tools to detect communications that may be problematic. Next slide, please. We think about our impact in terms of trust and in terms of reach. We've reached over 1.5 million people on an individual level. So not just saying that we've spread a lot of information, but we've actually engaged with that many people. Recent surveys show trust statistics to be around 88%. And in the beginning of the COVID response, we started producing content related to the COVID-19 pandemic on Refugee Info, which is our flagship instance that's now based in Italy, to speak to people's specific situations. And that is related to expiring visas, people's worries about being evicted from their homes, about economic livelihoods, about the freezing of the asylum process, and things that really impacted directly the individuals with whom we are working. 81% of the people that we surveyed in a recent survey said that they used Refugee Info to help make critical decisions. And 73% of the people that we surveyed said that it helped them know how to exercise their rights. Some minority language speaking populations in Italy also said it was the only information source that they had. Like Urdu speakers in this survey said that 76% of the respondents said it was literally the only information source that they had in this instance. And those are just some examples from that project. Currently, we're in the process of expanding our programming to new locations in the world, and we're broadening our partnership. In fact, we're working with NetHope just starting right now in Colombia, so we'll be designing and building out a program there to complement other existing information resources, as well as expanding back to Greece soon in Guatemala, and there's a number of other strong candidates on the horizon. Our goal is really to expand the service that we offer and really putting needs of communities first and reaching them where they are. We'll be trialing some new software platforms in collaboration with various tech companies to see how to best scale and increase greater functionality while reaching more people. So I think with that, I'll go ahead and cut myself off. I think I went a little over, so apologies for that. Effectively, we're here to collaborate and work with all of you, and we look forward to answering any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre. And thank you also to our attendees for posting your questions. So please do keep them coming. We'll have some time at the second part of the webinar to answer those. But first, I'm very excited to hear from Victoria about her initiative in Taiwan. Victoria will be sharing some work the NDI did using digital tools against COVID-19 related to disinformation in Taiwan. So Victoria, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon and good morning. Thanks, John and Andre. It was really interesting learning about your work, and thank you to CRS and NetHope teams for allowing this to happen. I'm Victoria Wellborn. I'm a program manager at NDI, where I work on global programs at the intersection of technology and democratic strengthening. So we can move on to the next slide and go ahead to the next slide. So for the past couple of years, I've worked with a group of civic technologists, the Code for All network, and to help amplify their good work around the world on a variety of issues related to good governance. And as civic tech has also continued to broaden the scope of issues that it responds to in order to strengthen democracy, one of the topics that has really emerged has been combating disinformation. And within Code for All, one of the local organizations that's made significant progress is called GovZero. It's a decentralized organization of volunteer civic hackers based in Taiwan. GovZero, it's a civil society organization that works in collaboration with government to use technology to really to better facilitate citizen participation and to involve citizens in other matters related to Taiwan's democracy and elections. So during the past few election cycles, Taiwan has found itself in the midst of foreign influence operations, and civic tech and fact-checking groups like GovZero, they've really been at the forefront of this information war. And so while NDI has worked with GovZero on a variety of projects, most recently we've worked to amplify a few of their projects related to disinformation around elections. So GovZero's disinformation projects have played a very important role in protecting Taiwan's information environment during specifically this most recent general election, which took place in January 2020, but elections prior as well. And it's also played a really important role in Taiwan's response to disinformation around COVID-19. So one of the projects that GovZero has started, and it's been a real pillar to their work, is called CoFacts. And it's a chatbot embedded within a messaging app that's very popular in Taiwan called Line. And when people receive information in a Line group, maybe like a family chat with 50 individuals, an individual can receive this information, this news article, to the chatbot, and it will then search a volunteer-driven database that confirms or denies its legitimacy. And so it takes the burden and the ownership off of the individual to call out fake news. By having this chatbot embedded within Line, it is able to kind of discredit this information and try to stop the spread. So Zero Archive is another GovZero project, which it's a public archive of Taiwan's information space with open source automated systems of tools for data collection and analysis. And really the thinking behind Zero Archive is similar to Bill Gates' strategy around COVID-19. In a recent op-ed that I read published by the Washington Post, Bill Gates said this on combating COVID-19. He said, "The government needs to step up on testing. We can't defeat an enemy if we don't know where it is. We need to be testing enough people that we can quickly detect emerging hotspots and intervene early. We don't want to wait until hospitals start to fill up and more people die." And this strategy, it really rang true to me because it's also very similar to Zero Archive's approach to the information space. It's exactly the same. Misinformation is a virus, and to defeat it, we need big data to understand it, to address it, and to get ahead of the problem. You can move to the next slide, please. So in January of this year, Taiwan had a very interesting general election. Taiwan's incumbent president, President Tsai Ing-wen, was running an election against the local mayor of a town called Kaohsiung. What was interesting about this election was how politically charged it was, with reports that the PRC was actively engaging in information warfare efforts to disrupt the 2020 general election and to really interfere with the re-election of President Tsai. So as the election drew near, the information landscape grew increasingly more chaotic in Taiwan, and groups like GovZero were working frantically to push back on this chaos. So in January, I traveled to Taiwan to film a short documentary on these projects and how they were being used during the election. And it's called Canary in a Digital Coal Mine. So if you want to look it up later, you can, or I can send it in the group chat if that's helpful. But we did this so that NDI could try to further share GovZero's work and to evangelize the story of civic tech and the good work that it's doing around topics like disinformation. But now what's interesting is, what I find most interesting isn't really what even happened on election day, but what happened the days following the election. And it's because groups like GovZero, they never quit working. Next slide, please. So after an election, you usually see a dip in the amount of fake news that is being pumped into the information space of a country being hit hard by foreign influence operations. It's because these campaigns, they're expensive and they take a lot of coordination, so it's not sustainable and strategic to kind of continue it after an election. However, after this election, the Taiwanese people, they continue to see a lot of continued disinformation because of the rise of COVID-19 in China. And what was interesting was the change of the content itself. The topics during the election focused on social and economic issues, which aim to undermine a leader's ability to govern. For instance, during the election, if the misinformation was not directly targeted to degrade President Tsai's merit and character specifically, many pieces of malinformation were related to fruit production. And this was an effort to create a narrative that President Tsai was tanking Taiwan's economy and being very frivolous in some of her policies and putting people out of jobs. But now, after the election, as we're moving into late January, February, March, after it was well over, and even whenever Taiwan was moving into the Lunar New Year, the amount of disinformation was not subsiding, and the narrative was shifting as people began seeing news related to healthcare aimed at undermining President Tsai's ability to respond and keep the Taiwanese people safe and healthy. But these two different types of fake news, while grounded in different events and about different topics, they have the same goal, really. It's to create distrust and dissatisfaction in government, to divide society, and to undermine the promise of democracy. And luckily, despite this shift, GovZero and many of our civic tech partners are well suited to continue to respond, and they're doing just that. Their relationships with government continue to be called upon. The infrastructure and tech tools are still there, and everyone's just busier than they were expecting to be after an election. So just as we're seeing with many civic tech organizations who focus on disaster response, readiness to mobilize is the key, and it's an excellent asset that civic tech offers to combating disinformation. So while elections happen all over the world and at very different times, the disinformation around elections never really happens in a coordinated and uniform way. that affects countries at a global scale. But this pandemic, it's a very unique moment in time, and that all over the world we are experiencing the same threat relatively in unison. And the information space in some ways is even bigger than before because of this unified fear. So I want to point out that looking at pandemics specifically throughout history, we've seen pandemics as an opportunity to further discriminate against marginalized groups. And one thing that we're seeing in the information space today during COVID-19 is that disinformation is depending on this fear. We are seeing foreign-produced disinformation that elicits xenophobic responses in the hope that people will respond in a hateful way, perpetuating the goal of dividing people and further breaking down democracy and society. So, while in the COVID era, tech tools have a very important role in protecting the information environment, we must also continue to be thinking of ways to work in conjunction with technology to come together and to build trust and to teach people how to understand the information they are consuming, to not let misinformation prey on this fear of the virus and to continue to divide our communities. So I'd be curious to talk with you all today to hear more about other projects that are working on to answer any questions. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. And thank you for all the very insightful presentations. Now we have time for some questions, and we have received quite a few, but please still feel free to post them in the chat box. My first question is for John, but I also like to invite Victoria and Andre to comment as well, if you like. The question is about counter messaging. Susanna from the University of East London is asking, John, can you tell us more about how the counter messaging has been designed and how effective it has been?
Thank you very much for your question. So what happens with the counter messaging is we use the same approach. After crowdsourcing rumor reports and verifying, what we do is that we send back information to those people who had asked about a certain rumor. So we can either use an SMS platform, and the good thing is we've also trained volunteers whom we call community ambassadors in each and every village in areas that you're operating. So assuming someone hears a rumors about village B and you have a community ambassador in village B, we'll contact our ambassador in village B and they'll tell us what is happening in that area. We're also using community radios now, integrating the system into community radios in most parts of Kenya, and we're looking forward to do the same in Uganda and South Sudan. And we're also trying to also introduce new methods like using WhatsApp platform. We are looking into introducing chatbots that will be automatically responding to individuals with questions. Then how effective it is that we've done several surveys to measure the effectiveness of the initiative, and the results are very impressive because as I had mentioned about when we did a survey to see which source of information people trust the most at local level, most people voted for HAKIKA, and this came if you look at the area, there is a local radio and TV, but people decided to choose HAKIKA. So that shows that people really trusted the source of information, and they felt that it's one of the ways that they could get accurate information. Hand over to Andre or Victoria.
Sure, I'll be happy to say a few words. I'll keep my comments brief. There is a strong evidence base that suggests that only countering misinformation or like debunking fake news is not necessarily an approach that works in isolation. If only working that way, a lot of the evidence base suggests that countering fake news with real news only reinforces a lot of the belief in the fake news among people who had initially been receptive to it. So our approach tries to lead with news that offers useful information related to a broad range of topics that are of concern to the affected community, as well as dispelling some of those rumors in a responsive, interactive way. So much like John's project as well. But we try to focus on a much broader spectrum of information exchange among people, to not just touch on those rumors, but to really touch on a lot of other areas that are of practical value to people in their everyday world. And that's sort of our model of trust building with Signpost.
Yeah, and our end, to just, echo Andre's comments, fact checking cannot be done in a vacuum. As he mentioned, it will oftentimes have a counter result and further perpetuate the narrative that's being told. And I see in the comments someone even asked, if populations are already divided in democracy, what type of counter messaging is effective? And I think that, again, this must be done, and our method is to do this also in person, to have a complementary community building model of bringing people together and having roundtable discussions and trying to build consensus and trust, both online and offline.
Thank you very much. But that is also a very good transition to my next question, offline. So obviously not everybody will have access to mobile phones or the internet. There's also a digital gender gap. So what other mechanisms do you use to identify or to identify rumors, or to send communication? So maybe I can ask John again to kick us off.
Thank you very much. So as I had mentioned, we've trained the people we call community ambassadors, and they are the people who also help us to crowdsource rumor reports from people who cannot read and write, those who cannot afford mobile phones, because they're members of the community. So they're the human face of the project. And aside from that, right now, as I said, we're working with the community radios as channels also to disseminate the information. And we, in Uganda, in northern Uganda, we are partnering with a different organization where we've introduced small speaker boxes that we record messages on them and then pass over to the community members. And every other time there is a new information coming up, we do the recording again and then supply them to the community members using memory sticks. Andre?
Thank you. Yeah, this is it's actually a very complex question in terms of access to technology. Whether or not people have smartphones that they can access the internet with is one point, but it's also who within a community can access the smartphone. Where is it safe for them to access the internet? Do they have limited access to the internet, or are they able to use all of it? Can they only use WhatsApp? Do people even use text messages, or are text messages too expensive? And so basically, given the complex nature of this, we always begin our programming with design workshops that include affected communities, as well as the technology backend that we provide, as well as other practitioners in partnership, to try to create a model that will best meet specific needs of people who are neglected or left out of the design model. So often we'll deploy content via the form that's most appropriate. And in some instances where there isn't mass access to technology, but there is some technological infrastructure, which is pretty much everywhere in the world at this point, we'll sort of equip community focal points or practitioners with resources that they can then go on to share and leverage the good work that other partners are doing in face-to-face or over the radio. So it's really a combination approach and really designing products with the user in mind, whether they're elderly, don't have really high level digital literacy skills, or disabled, to really make the best product that's most broadly acceptable to everyone.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that it really depends on the context, and doing some deep kind of analysis and diagnostics to understand what is needed and how to address it. I mean, I think when in situation in contexts when internet might be low, or maybe smartphones are not being utilized as often. What we try to do is work with local leaders, local councils, and try to, even go back to kind of basic D&G models of having the local officials be trying to communicate best practices and understanding to counter the narratives. In Serbia, we were seeing cases of Russian disinformation being actually infiltrated the most in certain communities by word of mouth. I heard an example of there was a local dog show, and it was full of Serbians in a very rural community, and there were instances of folks kind of infiltrating those environments and kind of spreading rumors. And so it was, what our approach was trying to build awareness and to understand the context in which information spread and flowed. John's example of radio, I think, is a great one. Excuse me. In Taiwan, where internet use is so high, we are oftentimes working. GovZero, for instance, is working directly with and in collaboration with government to produce counter narratives that are. They're oftentimes using humor to try to be a positive but counter narrative in a way that's not inflaming, but is educating and almost poking fun at a government official. Will almost poke fun at him or herself to try to make a point and to counter the narrative.
Thank you very much. Since you already mentioned different regions, Victoria, one question was, is there a difference between rumors in different world regions, whether it's in Africa, Europe, Asia? Obviously, John already gave us some examples of misinformation and rumors. Do you have any experience on this? And the same goes to Andre.
Sure. I think oftentimes you see the rumors, the misinformation, the disinformation. I mean, it can be a foreign influence, or it can come directly from an authoritarian leader within the country itself. So, while the types of content may change regionally, I think oftentimes the modality and the methods are often very similar. So what we try to do is actually bring together folks from a variety of regions to share best practices, because there really is a lot more to be learned from common examples, even though the means in which it may be spreading, we're seeing, I believe it's in Nigeria, a primary way of spreading misinformation for a while. Facebook was seeing that it was being done with emojis, and it took a little while to diagnose, but the means in the end is all the same. So we actually have a lot more that we can learn. And what's also interesting is that you have these countries who are kind of at the forefront of receiving some intensified disinformation. So I think learning the best practices of these, canaries in a coal mine to share with the rest of the world, I think is just completely needed and necessary at this point in time.
Yeah, and from our side, I'd like to emphasize that while combating rumors or misinformation is certainly critical and important, also leading with contextualized information that really speaks to the problem where the rumor might have come from is a strategy that is cross-cutting and can function whether in the United States or a much farther afield, anywhere in the Middle East or Africa or anywhere for that matter. And that is that contextualized information that speaks to communities' needs is so much more important. And if we take, for example, public health and social distancing information that is in total overload right now in the world, many people don't have the ability to fully comply with public health measures that are put forward. And so what do you do with that information? If somebody tells you to do a number of different things about keeping distance from people and washing hands, but you don't have the soap and you don't have access to water without coming into contact with more people, how is that information useful for you? And so for us, really trying to focus on finding out specific needs and actually speaking to people where they are in the context they are on the platforms that they use, this is really the way to lead with the best information. And often in that process, you have the ability to kind of debunk some of the rumors that are out there. So our approach is context matters first and foremost. It's really king in designing an information program. And that when you speak to people where they are in terms that they understand in a context that they live in, that's their reality, and they recognize that in the information that you put forward, that's the strategy to debunk rumors.
Thank you, Andre. I have a question, particularly for you, since you mentioned earlier your staff and the skills required. Since you said, yeah, particular local context is critical, like the language, the culture, political sensitivities. What process do you use to identify and recruit on-the-ground teams that can be effective and credible?
Am I starting with this question? Or
yes, please.
Oh, okay.
If you're happy to.
Oh, my apologies. I didn't know if that was for whom it was directed. For us, we just seek to employ moderators from affected communities themselves, so that they're already speaking the language, they're already a part of those communities. We hire editorial teams that are good at packaging information and understanding how to make it most accessible. Which is a specialized skill set, but you know, there's people who study this in every context around the world. But yeah, just communities first, and special skills to do special work that requires a lot of studies. So yeah, editorial staff and local community members. We have a rigorous training program and training materials to help offer some guidelines that they use to implement.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, John, Andrea, and Victoria. Unfortunately, we're already at the end of our webinar. I know we still had a couple of questions, which I would like to send you via email and see if we can include them in the post webinar summary. But yeah, for now, that I thank you very much for your contributions and for making this also a very relevant webinar. And thank you to NetHope for facilitating this and for our attendees for joining us. I'd like to highlight that tomorrow is the Global Digital Development Forum. It's a 16-hour virtual event with all kinds of digital content. If you haven't registered yet, I will post the link here. And then we also have a webinar on tailoring malaria interventions during COVID-19 next Wednesday. And then on Tuesday, May the 19th, we will be convening back on this platform here, looking at supporting farmers globally with low-cost digital tools. A lot of content coming up and more to be shared virtually. Before you log off, please take a moment to fill out the webinar feedback form. We really love to hear from you, how you think this webinar went, or if you have any advice for us to improve future ones. And thank you a lot. Have a good rest of your day.